The actress who played Margot Lane longest, from 1949 through the end of the network run in 1954, is the beautiful and charming Gertrude Warner. Recently, in her New York apartment, Miss Warner recalled her days on The Shadow.
We would sometimes do 3 to 4 shows a day, running from CBS to NBC, and sometimes would turn down work at WOR because it was too far away. It was on 40th. Anyway, some gal said to me, "You going to audition for The Shadow?" I said, "Yeah, what's going on? I hear they're replacing. What's going on?" I said, "I don't know." Well, I said, "We'll find out when we get there." I was dressed up in my best navy blue dress and a 3-strand choker of pearls. So down I went, and we were all sitting around, 15 or 20 of us. And so I read the lines, and then the director said, "Now we have to hear you scream, because Margot screams most of the time, underwater, wherever. She has to scream." I said, "You really want to?" "Yes." So I had been studying with Kay Thompson, and she was telling me how to use the diaphragm. She said, "You don't have to, just take a little quick breath and you will scream forever." Well, I did that, took a little intake. This choker broke. It was like a hailstorm. Pearls were bouncing through that. I was trying to catch them. Finally gave up. It was up where you had to be there. And I got outside, and they said, "What was going on in there?" I said, "It's all about my pearls." I said, "You'll do anything to get a job. You just do anything." So I think that's why I got that job. I really do.
Miss Warner recalls an incident with Shadow director Chick Vincent.
He had a very high-pitched voice. He talked, all right, let's go." And when I first started, I said, "Chick, how would you like this play?" He said, "Fast and sexy, honey, fast and sexy." Well, anyway, he was a darling guy. One day on the air, the bad guy was supposed to shoot somebody. It was supposed to be a shot, and I was supposed to scream, and then Brett was supposed to come in. Well, there was a sound man, and the cue for the shot, and we click, click, click. The darn gun wouldn't go off. Suddenly, Chick comes roaring out of the control room and says, "Bang, bang, bang, bang." That was live.
Miss Warner made a career out of playing the detective's girlfriend. She starred on Perry Mason and Ellery Queen, as well as on The Shadow.
By the time I did it, it was WOR. That was a beehive. It was Nick Carter next door. There were shows going on there all day long. It was like a small town, really. There were so few of us. And we were dashing in and out, and we got to know each other so well. We knew how we would react. Only once did I do this. We broke up on the air, and that was awful. We could not get control of ourselves. That was William Redfield. And Bill had dancing blue eyes. And he could look at me. I couldn't. I always worked with my script in front of my face. I said, "Billy, don't do this to me," because I was gone. I was just gone. And one day there was a very pompous character actor. And the leading lady's name on that particular thing, her name was Ginny. Well, he got up to the microphone. He said, "Ah, that's a good girl, Ginny." Well, Redfield looked over at me, and we were finished. We were all through. So every time I saw Redfield, he'd say, "Ah, Ginny, how are you today, Ginny?" So funny, so funny. But they were people with very quick reactions. You just didn't have time to study a lot, so therefore we were accused of being slick. We probably were. Because they said you had radio people in the theater. The first reading is what you get. You're not going to get any better. But they were lovely people. We helped each other. It seems so funny to me. It's all gone and will never return. It seems so funny. Because I can't think really of anybody. There was one actor we had a lot of stand-ins. We all had stand-ins. I understand Orson Welles never rehearsed. He always used to stand in.
The late Santos Ortega played Police Commissioner Weston on The Shadow for many years.
Santos Ortega smoked a cigar. And we'd be standing here with our script, and he'd set it on fire. And so we had to read faster and faster and faster and faster and faster before our page burned. Well, we took that in great good spirit, or he'd blow cigar ashes in our face, or somebody wouldn't show up, and we'd, for instance, I'd point to you and you'd read that line, and then I'd read the next line, we'd cover, and we just did that automatically. I don't know. I think maybe the shows are terrible. I don't know.
Miss Warner remembers well working with Brett Morrison.
When I first started, we had a longer rehearsal. I guess the budget was better. And so we would go and have maybe an hour and a half for dinner, then go back and record. And I had just had a wild experience with an organist I dearly loved, I worked with, who died. And he was he believed in reincarnation. So I was laughing about such a crazy atmosphere. And Brett was sitting there. He had a very, he said himself he looked like Buddha. In later years, he got quite heavy. And when he didn't wear his hairpiece, it was all skin. And he said, well, I've had several lives. Well, of course, I felt so silly. I said, you did? He said, yes. I was killed in the Roman, where's that place where the gladiators were? And I died. My parents were French peasants at some point, and I was a poet, and they wanted me to work in the fields. So I died in that life at age 29. Because I just was laughing about this story. I said, well, Brett, how do you find out about these things? He said, well, there's a place in Chicago. You can write and give your name, and they will give you all the information about your past lives. And he really believed that. He went on and on. His name was Bert, and he changed it, of course, to Brett because of those, whatever they told him there. It was a very high-pressure business. You had to quickly sight read. You couldn't be afraid. You had to be solid. If somebody missed a cue, you had to cover. Always good to have Conor Brett to do that. He was a very quiet personality. Used to cook food. Was a marvelous cook. Had a long Rolls Royce. He drove me to his country place, and he sat up where the chauffeur was. And I said, let me stretch out in the back. I couldn't touch the end of the car. He'd sit down and sing. He then became an executive at an Italian place where they did lip syncing. He was wonderful at that. But Brett could pick up a page and memorize it as he went. Gee, that's wonderful. I can't do that. I was on it for 5 years, and gradually they reduced the rehearsal time until at the end it was really pretty shabby. We didn't have any rehearsal at all. See, all right, look your script over and then we'll go. And what they said was, if it isn't good, we'll recut the line. But of course they never did. And we used to have an organist, and then we just had recordings. So they were all right, but they were mechanical. So really at the end, I was sort of glad that, because it was a travesty. The scripts got worse and worse and worse. It's like an aging actress having too many farewell performances. It was time. It really was. I don't know how Brett felt about it. He didn't express any great regret. And then about a year later, we were called to Y&R to do Margot in the Shadow in a commercial audition. And we did that, and then we walked back up Madison Avenue. He said, well, Trude, if they do it, they won't use us. They'll get kids who are younger. Ha, 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 ha. And I think that's the last time I ever saw Brett. He subsequently moved to Palm Springs, I guess. I have a lot of things around here that he's given me, because if you went to his house, you'd say, gee, that's pretty. It would come in the mail.
Being the star of a network radio series was not necessarily a lucrative business, but there were other rewards as well. We asked Miss Warner how much she earned playing Margot Lane.
Hey, it was very cheap. They only paid $75. I think Brett got more. It was cheap. I'd be out in Long Island or any part. Well, what do you do for a living? Oh, well, I'm on radio. Well, anything we've ever heard. And I would mention all of these, what I thought were the classy shows. Oh, Then came the Shadow. The Shadow? George, come in here. She plays Margot Lane. And we began to see that that was stockbrokers, lawyers, stockbrokers loved that show. It was funny. And I liked it because I said, well, we're not making any money, but it's a lot of fun. We could jazz around. Maybe the dress rehearsal, we'd do accents or do crazy things. And the director could trust us because he knew that we knew what we were doing. You know, when you've done a show that long, it was enormous fun. It was always a bad guy. Brett always came to the rescue. We'd spend a lot of time on the screens and being choked. Then once I was sitting talking with somebody, and Brett was trying to rescue me, and he said, if anything's happened to Margot, that was my cue to scream from the cellar, where I was just talking to somebody, and poor Brett was going, well, I'll. Finally, I looked over, and he was, where I sat. But anyway, he could ad-lib his way out of that to cover for me. So I guess that's what, yeah, they were crazy.
It is ironic that, although Miss Warner played the role of Margot most recently, only one of her more than 200 performances is known to be in existence today.
We just thought it was going to go on forever. I mean, we just didn't believe it was going to die. I remember I went to a crazy astrologer, bald as a billiard ball, but he had one hunk of hair, like a chicken, just. And he said, you are going to lose all your work within a year. So when I left, I thought, what does he know? But it's true. It all went off. When I first started doing it, it seems to me we started on a Sunday at 1. And I think it went on at 5 or 5:30. Then gradually we'd show up at 3. And we would just have a quick 1-2. And instead of rehearsal, then Chick or whoever would go to the organist and say, cue here, music here, and so forth. And then, as time went on, instead of a careful timing, we would watch the control room and we'd get a signal, stretch it out, or you better pick it up. And that's the way it was sort of not well done. And if you fluffed, fine. But then you see, we didn't fluff very often. Or if we did, we covered for each other. But it got sloppier and sloppier. And then, as I say, when they got rid of the organist, and they had these bad, I don't know, what were they, 38s? What was the 78s? And those would wow in. Sometimes the engineer had to do that. The music would come in. It was just kind of sloppy. And then they weren't paying very much for scripts. Sometimes they didn't make any sense. And of course, we were so used to it, but the people coming in maybe were thrown off a little because they didn't get any rehearsal. It was cold. And so sometimes they'd miss a cue. I was kind of glad it was over.
Perhaps the person most responsible for preserving the Shadow broadcasts and continuing their tenure on American airwaves is California program syndicator Charles Michelson. We interviewed him recently in his Beverly Hills offices.
There was Superman who could do other things. He was a Superman. And there were other people who could do other odd activities. But that was the Shadows thing, and he was alone with it at the time of being able to cloud men's minds so that others could not see him.
Michelson's long association with the Shadow dates back to the 1930s.
It was a live production. It originated from the Empire Theater in New York before an audience of maybe 500-600 people. It was a famous theater, the Empire Theater. And different from the musical programs where they would send out a comic or somebody to pep up the audience and liven them up. The stage, the curtain was lowered, was down, and the theater went black, went dark. And there was nothing other than mysterioso music from the organ to set the mood. And finally, when the time arrived, 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the curtain went up, and the show went on. And everybody acted in front of this audience who were instructed not to make any noise or emotions, and they produced the show. The program was sponsored in the eastern part of the United States by the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Coal Company, DL&W Coal. But that was only in the eastern area where they sold anthracite, hard coal. I undertook to sell the program in the rest of the country. And so in the Midwest, it was run by Grove's coal tablets, four-way coal tablets, and they also sponsored on the Pacific Coast. In the mountain area, we had the program sold to a salt company. And so there were actually 3 different sponsors on the program. In order to provide for the commercials, the DL&W, the blue coal commercial announcer, stood center stage. The Grove's four-way coal tablet announcer was in a telephone booth on the left-hand side of the stage, while the Carey Salt Company announcer for the mountain area was also in a telephone booth on the right-hand side of the stage. It was up to the director to guide all 3 so that the commercials would all come out and finish at the same time. Heavens forbid if they didn't.
Any program on the air for as long as The Shadow was has to have had some embarrassing moments. Charles Michelson recalls 2 such incidents.
James Monks was one of the regular actors in the show, and he was a very popular actor at the time. This Jimmy Monks had another show that he was doing at another network from about 2:30 to 4:30, and knowing that he could do his part quite well, very well in fact, he was allowed to do this other show, and he would have a car standing by for him at the other studio, so that in the half-hour time period he could make it comfortably to our show. This particular day, we hadn't realized it, but there was a parade going on in Midtown New York, and all the streets were closed off. However, our rehearsal got through and we're ready to go on the air, and there was no Jimmy Monks. Fortunately, his part didn't begin until a little bit later on into the show. And we tried to locate him, made phone calls, and finally he rushes through the doors into the studio. Everyone heaved a sigh of relief. He picked up his script and he began to emote. The only problem was that he was reading from the wrong page. And the person who had died about 5 minutes ago was still alive, walking around without a head. And things like that did happen occasionally. There was another instance I recall where the engineer, when we were playing for the West Coast and so on, they didn't have the systems as they have now, but we ran repeats for the West Coast. And an engineer, probably not thinking or something, picked up part 2 of the program and put it on the turntable, not realizing that part 1 on the other turntable should have been the one he was playing. So he started part 2, he came to the end of the story, and there was a half-hour time period left with nothing to fill, so he put part 1 on. It appeared in the newspapers the following Monday morning. There was a terrible catastrophe.
Of course, in order for an error to be made, there must first be a script from which to err.
You have a man above and beyond the normal man who cannot be hurt and is a good man, and he helps you out of a bad spot, and he always makes the thing that's wrong right.
Sidney Sloan acted in and wrote many shadow scripts.
I invented Shrevey. Shrevey was my invention. Maybe I didn't create the name, but I created the type of character he was, a Brooklynese cab driver who thinks that he can settle The whole idea was that he would have a theory about how the crime was committed, and he would tell it to Lamont Cranston, and Lamont would always laugh at it and say it's funny, and it would always be a completely wrong idea.
In the late 40s, Sloan also served as script editor, but his first shadow script, Phantom Fingerprints, aired early on in the series.
What's a murderer electrocuted 8 years ago got to do with the death of the doctor?
I don't know the answer to that, Commissioner, but there's an odd similarity in the murder technique. And as Dr. Giles pointed out, the weapon used on Dr. Kilgore left the same tri-cornered mark as found on Novelli's victims.
Yes, everything is the same. Why, if I didn't know Novelli was dead and buried, I'd say he was our man.
Now, wait a minute, gentlemen. I can see exactly what you're thinking. Killer Novelli comes back from the dead to kill a man he never had anything against. Oh, no, Cranston.
All right, Commissioner. Now, what about fingerprints?
As I told you before, Cranston, a smart criminal doesn't leave his prints around.
But O'Reilly found a clean-cut set of prints right in the center of your desk, Chief. He's down on the files right now, checking up on them.
What? On my desk?
You say a complete set of prints was found?
4 fingers and a thumb, all perfect. No smudges.
Perfect. Well, you're very fortunate, Weston.
Phantom Fingerprints was the first script I wrote, and I know exactly. The story about that is interesting because I was acting on the show the week before, and Bill Tuttle was directing. This is a new assignment for him. And Bill was an old friend of mine from Chicago, and we'd been at the Goodman Theater together. And Bill called me and said, several times, I had worked on the show several times before, and we were doing a script. I don't know whose it was, but he said to me, hey, this is a hell of a script, isn't it? This is a marvelous show. I said, no, Bill, this is pretty hackneyed. This has been done before, and there's very little originality in this script, and you should look for some new sharp points that would attract an audience, because when they hear this, they're going to say, I can't tell you what the story was at this point. But the audience will say, oh my God, they're doing that one again. You know, the mad scientist or something in business where he's going to blow up the world. And he said, well, if you think you can do better than this, why the hell don't you write for me? I was writing for quite a few other shows at the time. I said, all right. So I wrote a script, and that was the first one, was the Phantom Fingerprints. The whole idea was when the police found a body floating in the river, and the fingerprints were so swollen and changed that they couldn't get an absolute print that was clear. What they would do is remove the skin on the fingers and put them onto a glove and make an impression with these fingerprints that was much clearer than they could get from the dead man. Well, my idea was that someone could pretend to be someone who was already dead for a year or two, had been executed or something, and they got hold of his fingerprints and were able to leave his signature on every crime he did, which they loved. Bill loved that one. But it was based on an actual true incident.
Today's story, Sandhog Murders. Deep under the river, knee-deep in glacial muck and slime, you'll find them. The sandhogs, working under terrible pressure. Pressure beating against their eardrums. Pressure forcing little nitrogen bubbles into their bloodstreams. Pressure that causes death. Pressure that keeps the river out of the tunnel that men are building under the river. 100 feet under the river.
Sandhog Murders was an interesting one because I actually went down when they were building the East River, the 33rd Street tunnel. I got permission to go down there, and I came down, and it was a pressure tunnel, and it was rather frightening because we were in something like 50 pounds per square inch or something, and we had to get used to it slowly. And you're in the pressure, and you're all right. And when you come out, you've got to come out slowly. It puts you in a tank to release the pressure. And it was a little frightening, but a marvelous feeling later, because I was able to get the feeling of the fright that you feel when you're under there. And then they told me about things that happened where the pressure got so great underneath that they would blow right out into the river. They would blow the men right out into the river.
Today's story, Murder in the Death House. It is 7 o'clock in the evening. Margot is in the office of Wilson M. Tuttle, head of the new reform party called the Citizens Committee.
Tuttle was our director, and I used his name just for fun, and also because we could get a release from him. Wilson Tuttle.
We asked Sidney Sloan how long he took to write a shadow script.
Never more than 8 hours. Never more, sometimes less. And I'll tell you what, they used to say to me, what's your next story? We got a story for us. And I'd give them a title without knowing what the story was. And I'd write the story from the title. And that's me sitting down, and I'd start at midnight, looking at a blank wall with an old Underwood typewriter in front of me. And I'd start writing the darn story, and I'd end up by falling asleep on the typewriter with the whole thing finished. But I was too tired to go upstairs and go to bed. I was in the cellar of the house, in the basement of the house that we had. $200 was a lot of money in those days. When I first got associated with the show, I said to him, well, good God, if he can become invisible at will, all he has to do is follow the man he suspects around and catch him, that's all. They said, oh no, forget that. Forget that. What you do is you write a good, straight mystery story, and then you throw the shadow in to solve it. I mean, you bring him in, sometimes you bring him into the last minute. You bring him through in a light way as Lamont Cranston. Then when he becomes a shadow is when you throw him into the plot. And it worked. The audience loved it. I remember we had the Crosby rating at that time. And I remember that the rating was up on Sundays, something like 19.5, which was the highest dramatic show on the air, a mystery show. Of course, you had to keep it clean, and the same rules about sex or even mentioning pregnancy or anything like that was taboo. Dope was absolutely taboo. Alcoholism was taboo, except for the villain, the heavy. He could be something of an alcoholic, but no one who was a decent guy could ever be a drunkard.
One question listeners always seem to raise concerns the propriety of the Lamont-Margot relationship, especially during the period that the shows were originally broadcast. Brett Morrison and Grace Matthews.
Well, I've wondered about that many times myself. We sort of cavorted all over the world, I know. And had this strange relationship.
I know. It's absolutely true.
Here were two unmarried adults, man and woman, who were not only completely at home in each other's living quarters, but traveled the world together and addressed each other as darling. Grace Matthews.
I've heard our friends joke about, about now look, really, sort of thing. But I don't think that was a big thing, because it was there was an unreality about it.
Sidney Sloan.
The whole idea was to keep it a little bit naughty without really saying anything, because we always thought that this was a love affair. Lamont, and because it had gone on so long, they were almost like man and wife. There was no lovemaking on the show, but they were very fond of each other. This is the whole idea. It never went beyond that. But we always, in the people mixed up in the show, always made cracks about their relationship. They were always kidding the people who played Lamont and Margot.